Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. As you know, we're actually going to be live broadcast today on the Leading Safely podcast. You're in for an interesting chat. We're going to be discussing the recent case with the former manager of the Queensland Museum. And I'm going to go into a little bit of an overview, which is directly from the spiel that was published by the Office of Workplace Health and Safety Prosecutions, just to give everyone an overview for those of you that are not familiar with the case. So on the 29th of March 2023, a museum's work health and safety and risk manager was sentenced in the Brisbane Magistrates Court for breaching Section 32 of the Work Health and Safety Act, having failed to comply with her primary health and safety duty, which is under Section 28. The defendant was employed by the museum at South Brisbane, in Queensland, in Australia, for those of you who are not from Australia. And the scope of the museum's activities extended to the preparation of animals to be presented as exhibits. The preparation area for these exhibits was known as the evisceration area. So work within that area included sourcing and preparation of exhibits, which entailed carcasses being skinned, flesh being stripped from their carcasses and prepared, and you guys can get the picture from it. At times, the work also involved collection by museum staff and subsequent receipt of carcasses from roadkill or animal care facilities. The work entailed exposure to animal organs and fluids, carrying with it the risk to workers of exposure to animals that obviously may carry the Q fever virus. So in January 2019, a worker employed by the museum area was diagnosed with a spinal abscess resulting from chronic Q fever. From at least 2015, the defendant was aware of the risk of Q fever to museum staff carrying out taxidermy work. In June 2015, the defendant attended a workplace health and safety presentation on biological hazards, headed by an inspector who spoke to the defendant personally regarding the illness risks from taxidermy work on native animals. Then on the 15th and 16th of October 2015, the defendant exchanged communications with the inspector that specifically dealt with queries raised by the defendant concerning Q fever exposure for museum workers and the controls available to manage the risk and the exposure, obviously. Following this, the defendant then commenced a risk assessment, but failed to finalise it. And we will go into a bit of, detail and discussion around that as well. And obviously, no controls were implemented. So we're going to jump straight into some questions. The idea is it's going to be a general discussion, but I've got some questions that should hopefully guide the discussion as well. And I want to start with getting some general views around the table and opinions or thoughts on the case. So who would like to go first?
It's a fascinating case, one of the more fascinating cases this year, and highlights a whole lot of issues that aren't highlighted by other cases.
Most definitely. Yeah. Naomi, any thoughts to share on what it's done?
I think it's created a little bit of concern amongst the profession. People sort of have jumped on the fact that the role was a health and safety manager. However, the prosecution is of a worker, so some clarity around that's really important. What does that really mean for health and safety people?
And from my perspective, from a culture perspective, it raises for me a lot of questions about what else was happening within the organisation that contributed to the circumstances and the risks and the actions that were or weren't taken and then to the prosecution, and what roles do people within the organisation have in that?
Super. Nektarios?
Yeah, I believe it's a wake-up call for the profession in Australia and worldwide, and to maybe an opportunity to reposition what we are, what we do, what we should or not do. So that's right. And we still have to show empathy and compassion for the victim.
Yeah.
Okay, of the virus infection.
So two things. Obviously, first you heard from very different views around the table, which reminds me that I probably should introduce everyone before we continue in case you didn't read the brief on who was here. So we have Nektarios from QUT. So Nektarios is an associate professor in the diploma program. Is that right, Nektarios?
Yep.
Perfect. Very famous. We have Alan Girle, special counsel with Macpherson Kelley. Naomi Kemp, who is the chair of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. And of course, the lovely Georgia here from Henry Reid, CEO and founder of Henry Reid. And obviously, I'm Georgina. We should also check that we are recording, Alan.
Oh.
Is that okay? Could we please?
I'm
Sure it's
not
happening?
sure if it's happening, but
Okay. let's hope it's happening. If not, it is what it is.
It is what it is, yeah.
Alrighty, so I guess the first question I want to guide the discussion around is how can organisations ensure that their health and safety risk assessments are being effectively completed and implemented for those risks that are considered a low probability, so something that's not potentially, high risk or not probable of occurring.
So put that question to me another way.
Okay, what are the measures that an organisation could take to ensure if they identify a risk that they follow through with putting in place doing a risk assessment and following through with control measures?
I think that the practices that exist in the industry continue to be valid, which is you have to identify as many hazards as you can without being silly, of course, and you have to risk assess those hazards and then prioritise the risks. I don't know that this case really reveals whether or not you must address risks, although certainly if you've identified a risk and you fail to make a decision about that risk, you're exposing yourself to the potential to be charged. This case is really, one of the fascinating aspects of this case is that the risk was a low risk because the probability of the event happening was very low. That wasn't really thrashed out in the case, but that's one of the interesting aspects. Another interesting aspect is that the defendant in this case had a discussion with Workplace Health and Safety Queensland inspectors or an inspector, and that conversation was reduced down into email correspondence, and that meant that there was a discussion with the regulator about the risk. Now, once you enter into a discussion with the regulator about the risk, I think it's pretty brave not to action it at that point in time.
Yeah, and I think we were having this discussion earlier, weren't we, about how potentially it came about, I guess. How was it recognised that the risk wasn't mitigated, controlled, however you want to?
Well, the legal profession is normally very cautious about people talking to inspectors, and I think this case proves it. The defendant had a discussion with the government inspector. She may have thought that was an off-the-record discussion. She may have thought it was a friendly conversation where the inspector would help her, but the bottom line is she probably never would have been charged if she hadn't had that discussion.
Interesting thoughts.
Well,
Want to weigh? Oh, Nektarios, want to weigh in?
I don't know you understand, but this is something we cannot test. So you have a presumption. I would say that showing this awareness and appetite to receive information from whoever can give the information is a positive thing for workplace health and safety. Maybe not from the litigation perspective. I understand that. But back to what Georgina asked. This case highlights the need to have a risk owner. So having a risk management process and risk assessment and just say, we should do that and leave it open, it's a problem because somebody needs to complete the risk assessment. And then the health and safety staff undertaking this role is outside any well-known practice, effective practice, because we're talking about consultation, we're talking about completing risk assessments by the ones who own the risk operations, with the advice and expertise, of course, and technical knowledge by the health and safety staff. On the other hand, it's not exceptional. I have had a student, still studies with us, when I asked the student who does the risk assessment in your company, it's a construction company, not a huge one, medium size, say, I do everything. And I say, why do you do everything? It's not your role to do that. You undertake this role and this responsibility, because when you say, I am responsible for making all risk assessments and leading the decisions to applying controls or not, then of course you expose yourself to litigation. And the second part of the question by Georgina, yes, it was a low probability event, but the law doesn't say that you should not take controls, apply controls even for those low probability but high severity events. So that's another let's say, misunderstanding in the industry that because it's low probability, let's leave it somewhere there. We're going to deal with that later. So that's not the spirit of health and safety management, risk management, literature, and good practice, and maybe from the legal perspective.
I agree with what you say about a risk owner, but I think I need to point out a few things that happened in the case. So the prosecution, when it advanced its case, said that the defendant knew of the risk as established by the correspondence with the inspector. So the evidence of knowledge was the correspondence with the inspector. Knowledge of actions that could be taken to address the risk were the documented emails with the inspector, no other evidence. And then the failure to take action, and I'll go a bit further with this one, the failure to take action was demonstrated by the emails with the inspector and that the actions that were discussed in the emails with the inspector were not taken. When you talk about ownership of the risk, which I agree entirely, a lot of work health and safety and OHS professionals will call themselves an advisor. By calling themselves an advisor, they try to distance themselves from responsibility. But even if you're an advisor, if you have to complete that advice process. So in this case, we don't know the full detail. All we know is what's reported. But in this case, the advice would be, here's the risk assessment. We think you should look at it and accept it or not accept it. And so the defendant in this case didn't complete that advice process in saying, this is what I recommend you do as a risk assessment.
Well, interesting perspective, because this is not what I understand as advice. Advice is to help you complete the risk assessment.
Oh, well, that's
Not to
yes.
yes.
Definition of advice. Yeah. Look, I get what you're saying, but there was no discussion in the case about that at all. There was no discussion.
And I agree, and I think it brings into, as I said before, looking at where are those roles and responsibilities, what is happening within the culture of the organisation, the influences that are leading to things being prioritised or not prioritised or raised as an issue. Because when you look at the responsibilities and the duties of an officer, that extends to many others in the organisation, not just for work health and safety. And so organisations that also have in their values, and this is our ways of working, and we value the health and safety of the people within our business, and we have a duty of care for the people within our business. How is that actually being reinforced when issues aren't being raised? So what we don't know is what is the environment that's impacted on decisions to raise issues or complete risk assessments on the prioritisation, and that can have a huge influence on how confident people feel to act in certain situations or not. And I think that's a big unknown in this case.
It is a big
well.
unknown in this case. And a clue there is it's very common when organisations and individuals are charged for there to be some discussion which results in the organisation continuing to plead guilty and the charges against the individual being dropped. Well, that didn't happen in this case, and this case lends itself to that sort of solution.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does. Yeah.
So,
There's some clues here. They reported the announcement says large workload, mentions treatment for depression
and anxiety.
Yeah, that doesn't seem.
Oh, so it says depressive symptoms.
Again, treatment symptoms. Yeah. Age of mature age. Now, there's the question. I mean, why does the patient have a large workload? Even if we appoint the patient, you will do the risk assessment, which technically is not correct. But let's accept that. So there's a large workload. So the PCBU here, supervisors, the treatment for depression, not clear whether this was known or not, because we have made privacy, about medical conditions, In the mature age, I'm not sure why they mentioned the mature age now.
I think put aside the mature age, But I think if we look at leadership within an organisation, and leaders have the greatest influence on the culture that's created within an organisation, and leaders showing a level of care and empathy and understanding of their employees are responsible for workload, are responsible for checking in and seeing how things are going. And if this is a contributing factor to someone acting or not acting on a risk or fulfilling the duties of their position, that certainly has a significant impact in the consideration. And it's the leadership and the demonstration of care, the duty of care shown to the work health and safety manager.
So how? Oh, you're right, Alan.
No, you go.
I was going to. So the question then is, I guess, how can organisations, support their employees with dealing with those large, workloads, or if there is identified mental health challenges, potential there?
I got the impression from the case reports that what they were saying, or the reports on the case, that what they were saying is the mental health issues were the consequence of the prosecution rather than
not precursor to the event.
Well, I say here,
I think the
at
workload.
the relevant time. So nothing that they're relevant yet. So talking about the circumstances at the time where the risk assessment was not completed.
I
agree. I think that's a big contributing factor as to where is the priority given. If you've got someone who may be in a depressive state or may have a high workload, where are the priorities and the influence from leaders and the business being placed to identify a risk, start a risk, seek advice, start a risk assessment and not complete it. And I think while I know there's no obligation to complete risk assessments if they've started, there was clearly some concern there, enough to seek advice and start a process. And then other things have
That was
stopped.
positive, I agree. And I would like Naomi's here opinion. I read the AI case as positive.
Naomi.
So I think
full of opinions.
So, in addition to whatever we discussed, here, very intriguing, since the incident, the worker had moved into human resources role at the museum, transitioning away from a safety role, and it tends to retire next year. So, there are plenty of readings, like, does the PCBU acknowledge that the person was incompetent? Is it a stigmatizing action? Does make things worse or better? Was the maybe preference of the worker? Is it what? So how do you read the reaction of the PCBU to the event?
I probably read it positively in that they're trying to care for their worker. I think it's positive that the worker still is employed. So they haven't laid blame on the worker, and perhaps
they haven't. So when they move you from your position to another, you think they don't blame you directly.
Do you not think there might have been a discussion about it?
Yeah, maybe I blame you, but understandingly, I will not.
Well, is the company blaming the worker, or has the prosecutor blamed the worker?
No, that was since the incident. Yeah, it doesn't say anything about after the trial or after the decision.
So that maybe they had a discussion about workload and things like that. Maybe they then decided to look after her mental
So we
health.
need more information because this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's all speculative, isn't it? We don't really know.
It is, and sometimes moving someone from a role where they've been established as and have previously been recognised for doing a good job, to then move them to something else rather than maintaining them in their area of specialty and reducing workload, or we don't know what the circumstances or the conversations. Sometimes that can have a further detrimental effect because of perceptions.
Yeah.
So we're making assumptions and acting on perceptions of what that shift might mean. Those perceptions happen within an organisation as well and can have a significantly negative impact on that person's reputation, on their well-being, on their mental health. So I think in considering responses to things like that, organisations need to be very careful in considering the messaging and the communication and the roles that are created around supporting their employees And there's a number of employees impacted in this. There's the employee who contracted the disease, as well as the employee in the work health and safety manager role. And that really is an essential part of the duty of care, is not just dealing with the incident, but what happens after it, and the perceptions and the communication and the actions that follow.
Yeah, and sometimes I think, and I've had some experience in that space of being relocated after events as well, we tend to forget about those organisational, I guess, cultures within crews, within offices, within departments, within divisions.
Yeah.
And as soon as you remove someone from that, it doesn't matter how confidential a case was. Obviously, this was in the public space. And if they were or weren't suffering in a depressive state, it is what it is. But that can further exacerbate those injuries, even further by moving them to a different location. Obviously, I'd hope, like Naomi said, there would have been, some discussion.
Maybe more suitable duties.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe
it is. Maybe it's
part of an alternative duties, like return to work plan, perhaps after they've been off for a period of time. I think the other factor that isn't really talked about is the worker that contracted the Q fever and the interactions perhaps that maybe they were trying to limit, there's so many factors that, again, like I said earlier, it's very superficial kind of what's in the media at the moment. And, to flag, like the hot principles and to flag the safety differently spaces, what is that context? And what are those choices if we take it back to the decision to not go forward with that risk assessment? What environment, from a cultural perspective, led her in that particular precise moment in time to drop that? Is it the workload? Is it what else was happening? And had she raised it previously? There's so many things that kind of red flag for me, like what kind of environment was she operating in, really?
Yeah.
That created it where she perhaps didn't feel like she could. Or obviously still speculation, just up in the air, but it's from on the ground, you're raising your eyebrows, Nektarios.
I can recall other instances from my own professional career in the industry. It was always a tendency to remove the person who was involved in the event to another task duty section department. And whatever the reason to protect, after consultation or not, for the peers, for the others, did not look good. So, because those discussions are not open, maybe for privacy also, reasons, the other workers, the staff, that see Nektarios getting moved from this, job duties to something after an event that most of us know, not publicly, but in the organization we know about many events, it doesn't look good for any reason. And if we want to be radical, Georgina, I would say the one that was involved and had a role to play in the responsibility and accepted that and learned the lessons is now more suitable for their role than before. Should stay in this role to do the job even better.
Well, it's a great learning experience, isn't it? And I think that I think in looking at any incident that happens in a workplace, and I agree, it's a learning opportunity, and I am now more aware. They now have had reinforcement of what's okay, what's not okay. But I think with the other communications and the team and everyone else, organisations quite often don't go back to what should be at their core, in the centre of communication, which is the core of their culture. What are their values? How do they align this back to, this is what's acceptable, this is what we value in the way we do things, and we use it to reinforce and learn from the collective ways of working within the organisation. And often the discussions are around the incident or a policy or governance or risk, rather than coming back to the core of what's most important to us and how we work with people and how we treat people. And I think that gets missed in a lot of transactional type discussions about, we need to put this band-aid on here, or we need to fix that, we need to move someone. What at our core is most important when we work with people, when we care for people, when we look at creating outcomes through our people. And that often is missed. And that's when people, being emotional beings, we fill in the gaps. We make up the story because we need a story. And if it's not aligned back to the organisation values, organisations miss an opportunity to use an incident like this to actually reinforce what's most important to them, and then create a learning opportunity. And I think that's where culture and risk actually are, two sides of the same coin. They're both really important. I think opportunities are missed when they're treated more transactionally.
We might get an opportunity to reflect on that if the views you've expressed, because if they're successful, if Queensland, the Queensland Museum is successful in getting an enforceable undertaking, then that will be published. We'll be able to read that, and there'll be some discussion from the organisation's perspective, or alternatively, if there's a court decision in relation to the museum, there might be some discussion on that as well. So you might end up being quite prophetic in terms of what we're going to hear about in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really important part of this in the what happens next. It's really important to watch this space, see how people are treated, how the organisation is able to respond and react.
Alan, I have a question, from the legal side of things. So here it is noted about the decision of the prosecutor to continue against the WHS while the enforceable undertaking was in process.
Yes.
Why? And I have read that on many posts online, so why do they highlight this? But
what document are you reading from?
That's the AI HSS announcement post.
They're always controversial.
So is there any controversy there indeed?
Well, there's certainly a lot of controversy. I'm not sure that it's legal controversy, but a lot of people are concerned that the worker is going to get a criminal conviction, albeit not recorded, and a penalty, whereas the organisation applying for an EU, which we might be successful in getting, that's seen as a lesser consequence for the organisation. Now, I don't know that that's true, but I've certainly seen in the comments and narrative about this case that sort of view expressed.
But EU does not apply to individuals, so
It can.
can apply to
Absolutely
individuals.
can.
Yeah, and that's really interesting.
Workers, officers, and PCPs. A person in connection to a contravention or an alleged contravention. The person is very broad.
Yeah.
The issue is that in Queensland, there is an administrative charge for an EU, which hovers around the $10,000 mark. So if you weigh that up as a worker and the penalty that you might be expecting as a worker, you would then financially weigh that up and sort of go, actually, is it worth?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of things that this defendant could have done that she didn't do, and we don't really know why she made the choices she made. But she could have applied for an EU.
Absolutely.
That would have been on the cards, and it would make a lot of sense for the organisation and the worker to apply at the same time. And she could have also contested the charge. I mean, it's definitely open for contest, but because she's chosen to plead guilty, she's guilty by her own admission.
The other thing is, like, I'm of the no blame space, right? But there are multiple people within that organisation that contributed to that manager making that choice on that specific day. And an EU addresses the organisation as a whole. Hopefully, maybe it'll address some individual kind of things in there. But we don't have that full context, again, around why she made those choices. And I dare say she did make a decision to not follow through with the risk assessment on her own. The workload was high because a manager made it so, or it was just known that she was constantly under pressure. There was numerous things that contributed to that, and those numerous things, context-wise, perhaps should have been addressed. And I feel like there are other people, and the organisation as a whole should definitely, be examining everything, not every individual, every person, every process, every system that contributed to that event occurring on that specific time and that specific day. That's what needs to be pursued. A really thorough, detailed investigation into why it happened. Not just go down the line of, okay, we're punishing, penalising the organisation and the person.
Maybe go to the EU.
Oh, Naomi,
come on.
You had said a lot there. So there's no doubt been an investigation. I would assume there's been an internal investigation. Well, there has, because they create a brief which goes to the prosecutor. We need to remember that a prosecution isn't an inquiry. It's a prosecution, so they're just going to pick up on legal arguments and what's important at the time. The EU came into the narrative, into the story, because the defence lawyer raised it in court, and there's a reference about equal justice from the magistrate.
Yeah.
And so I think that was potentially a legal strategy to talk to that the defendant was the only person to face the court.
Yeah.
Now that's obviously
strategically.
And that's obviously on the basis that right now they're in the development evaluation phase, or whatever phase it is of the EU process. If that gets rejected, then they go to court. So there's still a possibility of that happening. You also mentioned the risk assessment there and not completing that. I think the profession and the commentary that I've been reading online about the case, we're very much focused on the process of this risk assessment, and which is very health and safety. People do that all the time because that's our process. We created it, we drive it, we manage it. I think the critical fact here is that no controls were implemented.
Yeah.
So whether or not you even document a risk assessment, if you know the risk, and we all know that they knew about the risk, the company and the workers, and no doubt the taxidermist all knew about the risk, no controls were put in place. And I think that's the key part, is that you actually don't get prosecuted for not writing a risk assessment. You get prosecuted for not identifying
taking reasonable care
and putting controls in place. And then to the EU side of things, what was the specific question?
Examining the organisation as a whole. The
Yes.
EU process lends itself to that.
Yeah.
And so the one part there is what we don't know, because obviously there's EU process happening, is that may be the PCBU, and we don't know, but there may be directors or officers
as part of that as well. Given that we've seen a worker, I'd say it's highly likely that we might actually see multiple parties in that EU. Potentially, I don't know.
Wait and see,
that's true. We don't know whether it's an organisation or the directors of the organisation.
Or both.
And the other charges.
From a cultural perspective, Georgia, how do you see that?
I see that very rarely do things happen in isolation by one person making one decision. They're aware of company processes. Generally, we go to work to do a good job. We don't go to work to do a bad job. There are lots of things that influence our behaviours and our ability to raise issues or matters. So I think that things rarely happen in isolation, and those contributing factors around what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what support is provided, where are the boundaries, how tightly do we control how things are done as far as governance and risk, what are the contributing factors which led to overwork or high workload. We know at the moment it's very hard to hire people, so people leave our business, we can't replace them, so there's a whole lot of factors there that contribute to circumstances and a single point in time. So rarely do these things happen in isolation, and I think it's very, very challenging to say that's one person is at fault when there's systems of work, there's ways of working in collective behaviours. And there's a lot of people who have accountability. When we look at workers and officers and the PCBU, there's a lot of different levels of accountability there that is rarely would come to one person.
So what are the ramifications then, I guess, Naomi and Nektarios, for our profession, for health and safety professionals that are dealing with the no control side of things? How do you think that impact that face?
I will extend the nice comments by Georgie about the culture of the speaker.
Okay.
Talking about the professional, health and safety professional culture, I have seen the last 5 years, 10 years maybe, this tendency to show the professional the hero of the organization that will save the workers in the day. That's very dangerous, as you can see in this case. When you undertake more than what you should in your role as a health and safety manager, staff advisor, or whatever you are, and this inflation of pride that nobody cares more than us about health and safety, which is again very dangerous, because health and safety is not your job exclusively. It's your job to support health and safety management in the organization. So I don't know if it's something an evolving culture, Naomi, in the profession, that we are important and we want to feel important, but we are unique, not just important. And yeah, the second, I understand that blaming, pointing the finger on our patients is not productive at all. Of course, now pointing the finger to 10 more patients, I don't know if I will ameliorate the situation. So, I mean, if I perish the life, I don't know, overspeeding or 120 kilometers where the limit is 100, the fact that I will receive a fine and somebody might escape that doesn't mean that I should not receive a fine. So we need to be reasonable here. I understand the sentiments and the frustration because it's a worker, it's a manager, interpreted as a worker, which I think is correct in this case. Yeah, I don't know if it's productive to say, okay, somebody will pay $8,000 while Georgie and Naomi and Alan don't pay.
I mean, you raised another point too, which I think this case is going to bring out some debate on, which is the no-fault argument. And it's very popular for people to say we should take a no-fault approach to safety. And as an individual, I find that very attractive. Of course, it's a very attractive concept. But as a professional, I have to say that, and reluctantly say, that if you open the Work Health and Safety Act on any page, you will find penalties.
Yeah.
It is a command and control act. Now, I think the law is an ass in many respects, to quote Oliver Twist, and but the legislation framework that we deal with is one of a book of offences. And if you don't take that into account the way you operate professionally, then it's extremely dangerous. And when you start to go to I feel that when you allow that no-fault conversation to go too far, you forget that that's the system that we operate under.
Yeah.
It's interesting, that's the system that we operate under, but there's a shift in lots of legislation now when we look at proactive duties coming at the Respect at Work bill and requirements for actually not waiting and having that at fault and the penalties that happen, but really shifting mindset and organisations having to be prepared as that legislation starts to get tested in proactive duty. And I think this case as well highlights the need for organisations to actively and regularly be reviewing and checking in on what is happening, what are the things that might have been raised in a risk register, and why wasn't the risk assessment completed. So I think the shift in responsibilities for duties for officers is going to take on a new perspective as we get different legislation and proactive duties rather than looking at things retrospectively as well. I think that's going to be an interesting mindset shift for many people in their role in organisations.
I think it should also flag though from what Naomi was saying for all parties that contribute to identification of risk, that those control measures do need to be, like it has to be followed through on. Yeah. And it's regardless of whether you're the CEO of the organisation or you're Johnny Blogs who walked past something, identified it and said we're going to put a control in place, but then didn't go through with that. Yeah. And I think the other thing for me is in Queensland, there are some documented kind of requirements around the workplace health and safety officers' duties, like under the Act. Does this now highlight, I mean, when I do the Cert 4 in WHS as a facilitator, there's not been a case in Queensland, where someone has been held responsible, but it is in the Act, like here's what you need to do. Unfortunately, now we can no longer kind of say that. Alan, do you think that this is now kind of opening up, especially around identification of risk, implementation of controls?
There's been a huge shift over the last 5 years. And I should point out that the investigative role is conducted by Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, whereas the prosecutorial role ultimately is by the Work Health and Safety Prosecutor. And the Work Health and Safety Prosecutor has decided to prosecute workers much more frequently than it ever has in the past. And in the past, there was this unspoken rule that work health and safety professionals just never got charged. There was never any consideration of charging them. Well, that clearly now has changed.
It's changed.
Yeah.
Mary, anything to add on that?
Nothing to add specifically on that because I'm nodding. I think go back to your question about for the profession. Again, a couple of points is duty of the worker to take reasonable care that your acts or omissions don't adversely impact health and safety of others, workers or others. When I teach, coach with frontline managers, with CEOs, with health and safety people, take reasonable care. And what does that mean? What does that mean in your role and your responsibilities? Being out that beautiful document that we have in the system that says all these things that you need to do. And it's that act or omissions. I think there's a real, what have you failed? What have you omitted? What have you not talked about? What have you not followed through on in terms of control measures? What risk assessment have you not signed off? So there's important discussion there. It's one I have pretty much every workplace I go to and everyone I speak with. I think the profession needs to reflect on a couple of things. Obviously, continuing professional development. I'll give a plug for the Institute here, but attending those webinars. If you're in a workplace and there are risks or hazards that you aren't familiar with, get across them and understand them. Reach out to the broader network as well. Go to your local branch events and talk to the professor or talk to the lawyer and to ask, or the hygienist that might be there, to ask about those control measures. What are reasonably practicable, accessible? What are other people doing? There are plenty of other museums in Australia, so reach out to your professional networks as well.
There's a bit of pressure on the Institute at the moment to become an advocate for safety professionals as a result of this case. Is that going to happen?
You shocked me actually with that question. What do you mean by advocate though? Advocating for?
Well, I guess that the majority of the membership of the Institute is health and safety professionals.
Yes. And
this case is the first time that I know of that a health and safety professional has been prosecuted. Is there going to be any discussion, any position put forward to the regulators about how health and safety professionals should be dealt with by regulators?
I'll put that on my list. I mean, you've prompted me to talk about something else, but I don't want to I'll use it as a segue. So not specifically to that. Naturally, we've got the new offence in the WA legislation, so our attention has gone to that, and what will that look like?
Just explain that, because not many people will know about that.
Now I can't roll that one off the top of my tongue. Like
not word for word.
Queensland one. So it's related to an external person, so not a worker, who's providing health and safety service. And there's a few bullet points there. So training is a good example. But also they don't need to be in WA. So you might actually see consultants like myself in other states who have clients who are national, and you are creating documents or providing advice to them across borders. So there's lots.
Do you think that Western Australian provision could be picked up by the other states?
I think yes. yes.
It's hard. I think it's harsh. Like when you look at it, like I think it's a little bit harsher. That's something to say. Like when you talk about training, like it's almost to the point of like you have to ensure that if you're providing or if you're vetting training, like the RTOs, there's so much to it that boils down to. I feel like that's the harshest.
So why will it get picked up, just to answer that for the audience, is that all the regulators meet, and they call them HASA, or the Heads of Safe Work Authorities.
Okay.
And so we've seen the proliferation of industrial manslaughter across the state. So they obviously, they all go off and come together, they discuss emerging issues and things like that. Obviously, Boland review and all of those elements, our best practice review here in Queensland. So they all bring their insights. And often they will go off and pilot different things. So industrial manslaughter was sort of piloted here in Queensland, and then it's been picked up. So I would see the introduction of it over in WA is that if we start to see prosecutions over there, We might start to see it come into the other states and then into the modern laws.
And again, this extends to academics. It's not only about health and safety consultants per profession. When you provide training education for teachers there,
It could be lawyers.
It could be lawyers.
That's right, it's anyone who
it could be
provides
anyone
guidance for
providing
advice.
health and safety
Yeah.
advice.
Yeah, anyone.
And I think it's a really important thing because you can't outsource the risk. You can't say, well, I've given it to a health and safety consultant or someone else outside the organisation.
Unfortunately, that is the thing. Sometimes though, there are a lot of companies and organisations that rather I don't know what to do in this space, so I'll get a subject matter expert in, and then liability's gone. And as we've seen from a variety of cases, that isn't the case. There's still something that's safe with that initial company. So,
and there's an issue here that unfortunately this case doesn't flesh out for us. The duty of the worker is to take reasonable care, and we don't know a lot about what that is. It'll be an objective test, so it won't be a subjective test. But as Nektarios highlighted before, so this worker was experiencing anxiety and symptoms of depression. Whether that's something that could be taken into account, because that's very subjective, in applying that reasonable care test, we don't really know. As a matter of fairness, it sounds like you should, but we don't actually know that.
I think my little highlighted point here is the importance of listening and learning from an inspector. If you do have an inspector visit or you're having a conversation with them, they don't always have the answers. It seems to be in this case that it was an inspector with expertise within occupational hygiene, occupational health, who was giving some advice. So not too many people actually have the opportunity to, good or bad, to have an inspector turn up, or even have someone from the regulator, whether that's through IPAM program, which is the injury prevention program here in Queensland, small business advisors. So there's a number of regulators all have different types of education advisory services as well as the inspectorate. So sometimes you may never see someone, sometimes you might be unlucky enough to see an inspector regularly. It's important to learn from that experience. They're not all bad.
And that was where my thought process was going, Naomi. I think it's unfortunate, and it's fortunate and unfortunate that a lot of people have had some really terrible experiences with the inspectors who come to site. And I know that through time, the approach that the office and the inspectors have taken has changed, obviously, and their focus has been on various things and that kind of thing. Does it lend towards an educational focus? Is there an ability from this, not only there to be a learning for organisations on responsibilities, accountabilities, etc., but is there something that the Worksafe Queensland could learn from this, and perhaps, I don't know, like learning, like an opportunity for people to continue to reach out to inspectors and for there not to be a pursuance of punishment or penalty if they do reach out on behalf of, like asking a question. Maybe that would put you out of work, Alan, unfortunately.
No, I won't be put out of work.
Not?
The inspectors just keep creating it. I think you can it's good to have conversation because that's how you develop your knowledge. But if you're having a conversation with an employee of the regulator, you have to remember that they're the regulator. That's their job, is to regulate. So if you're having a conversation with Nektarios, you might treat that as being, in a colloquial sense, confidential. Or if you're having a conversation with a consultant, safety consultant, you might treat that as having some level of confidentiality. Certainly with a lawyer, it's true confidentiality. But if you're dealing with a regulator, it's not confidential.
I was just hoping that there was a space for that learning opportunity.
Well, I think it is, when we look at the role of a regulator, there is a shift happening in other areas and other regulators where the first instance is around informing and educating first and then enforcing and creating. And I think that's where regulators, across all industries can really take a more proactive role as well in raising awareness and educating as a core part of shifting mindsets and behaviours within organisations, developing and strengthening relationships between the regulator and employers and organisations as well, so that you're actually, what we want to see is an uplift. We want to see an increase in standards and ways of doing things. And the command and control, or the ways legislation's been written in the past, is actually not going to cut it when we start to look at the way.
It doesn't have to be that way.
No, I know, but I think the way that things have societally, we're evolving and we have different expectations, and there's a real need for regulators to take that positive, proactive, educated, informed role as well, and to look at a collaboration for how do we actually raise the bar in all of these areas and shift behaviours and mindsets.
And I'll give a plug for Kim now. So when they appointed Kim Bancroft into the role, which is technically the regulator, I was really excited by that because she brings a whole skill set into that role that I don't think it's had before. So we could see that in Queensland. We could see a significant change.
I think it's the Maybelline ad, it won't happen overnight, but it will happen. I think it's definitely doing some good work. It's just obviously it will take time to influence that. Speaking of time, I'm conscious it's nearly time to wrap up. So I guess closing remarks on what we've talked about today. The superhero comment for me is kind of stuck in my head. I see a vision of a safety superhero and a big cross through it now.
Superwoman and Superman.
I see superhero. That's gender. So Nektarios, what have you taken away? I guess what thoughts, opinions on what we've discussed, but also in general from the case.
Shocking, but after reading, not surprising.
Shocking but not surprising.
Yes, it was indeed the first time we saw this kind of prosecution. But when you read the details, I think we'll see more.
We'll see more
in the future.
Yeah. Alan, do you agree? Do you think we're going to see more? What's your closing remarks?
Unfortunately, I don't know the reasons why the Work Health and Safety Prosecutor made the decision we did to bring this charge. It does surprise me. If I'd been in his shoes, I probably wouldn't have brought the charge. Very interesting case.
Okay. Naomi?
The point for me is the magistrate considered that the defendant was not an appropriate vehicle for general deterrence. Which is a mouthful of words. What I take from that is that the profession needs to take a deep breath, do a bit of woosah, count to 10, think about acting with integrity, ethics, being professional, influencing up, all of those things that we talk about as trained, qualified, certified health and safety professionals, and you'll be okay.
And my thoughts are fairly similar to that. There's a lot of complexity in this, and it goes beyond the transaction and the process. And it's the being human part of this that needs to really be considered, and the care for each other, the understanding, the checking in, the complexity that happens within organisations and dynamics lead to these situations. So it's never just about a process and a failing of a process. And it needs to be examined more broadly than that, and how we actually are caring for each other, and how does that demonstrate in the way that we then carry out those different processes or raise issues and impact things in the organisation. So it's a complex one.
Oh, that's a really lovely way to wrap up the conversation. So thank you. And I think we're just bang on for time. So unless anyone has any other comments or remarks they would like to make, hopefully all of you who've joined us online have enjoyed it, found it interesting, got some insights from it. We'll obviously make the recording available for you as well. But thanks for joining. Until next time, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.